For 15 years, the only human voice Cora Abernathy ever heard was her own, a low hum against the whistle of the wind across the high chaparral. Her world was a 100-acre patch of hard-won earth, a sturdy cabin built by a father she barely remembered, and the silent, watchful company of the Dragoon Mountains. The solitude was a second skin, a fortress against a world that had taken everything from her. But on a Tuesday, choked by the breathless heat of August, the silence was broken. 7 shadows fell across her land, vast and silent. They weren't prospectors or drifters. They were Apache warriors, titans of the desert, and they hadn't come for water or war. They had come for her hand. The Arizona sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth of Cora Abernathy's homestead. At 22, her face was already a road map of its harshness, her skin tanned the color of rich saddle leather, and her eyes the pale blue of a desert sky at dawn were accustomed to squinting against the relentless glare. She moved with an economy born of solitude, her every action purposeful. The rhythmic thud of her axe splitting firewood was the only percussion in the vast, silent orchestra of the wilderness. Her father, Orrin Abernathy, had taught her how to survive here, before the fever took him and her mother 15 years prior. He'd taught her to read the land, to track game, to shoot straight, and most importantly, to depend on no one. Her homestead was nestled in a small, defensible valley, blessed with the rarest of gifts in that arid territory, a year-round spring. The water was her lifeblood, coaxing a stubborn vegetable garden from the soil and watering her 2 mules and a handful of chickens. The cabin was small but solid, built of thick pine logs, chinked with mud and stone, its single window facing east to catch the morning light, and its heavy door barred with a thick ironwood beam at night. It was less a home and more a shell, a place of function, not comfort. The ghosts of her parents were faint now, worn away by years of silent days and lonely nights. Cora finished splitting the last log and stacked it neatly against the cabin wall. Wiping a sheen of sweat from her brow with the back of a calloused hand, she paused, her senses on high alert. Something was different. The usual chatter of sparrows in the cottonwood by the spring had ceased. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Her hand went instinctively to the Colt Peacemaker, holstered on her hip, its worn grip a familiar comfort. She scanned the ridgeline that formed the western wall of her valley, her eyes missing nothing. For a long moment, there was only the shimmer of heat rising from the rocks. Then they appeared. They did not ride in with whoops or hollers. They materialized from the landscape as if born of the heat and dust itself, 7 figures on powerful paint ponies cresting the ridge in a single formidable line. They were massive men, broader and taller than any she had ever seen in her rare trips to the nearest settlement of Redemption Gulch. They were Chiricahua Apache, their long black hair held back by simple bands, their chests bare and gleaming with sweat, their legs clad in buckskin leggings. Each man carried a rifle across his lap and a bow slung over his shoulder, but it was their presence, their sheer, overwhelming stillness, that sent a spike of pure adrenaline through Cora's veins. She didn't run. Her father had taught her that panic was a luxury you couldn't afford in the wild. She stood her ground, her feet planted firmly in the dirt she called her own, her hand resting on the butt of her Colt. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild drumbeat, against the sudden, profound silence. She watched as they guided their horses down the rocky slope with an effortless grace that belied their size, their ponies' hooves making almost no sound on the hard-packed earth. They stopped about 50 yards from her cabin, a respectful distance. The man in the center who seemed to be their leader dismounted. He was the largest of them all, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from the granite of the mountains themselves. High cheekbones, a strong, straight nose, and eyes as dark and intense as obsidian. A single eagle feather was tied in his hair. He handed the reins of his horse to the man beside him and began to walk toward her, his steps deliberate and unhurried. He was unarmed, his hands held open at his sides in a gesture of peace, but it did little to quell the storm raging inside Cora. She drew her pistol. The click of the hammer being cocked was unnaturally loud in the silence. "That's far enough," she called out, her voice, rough from disuse but steady. The man stopped, his dark eyes fixed on her. He showed no fear, no surprise. He simply waited, his gaze unwavering. He stood a good 20 paces from her, close enough for her to see the intricate beadwork on his moccasins, far enough that he wasn't an immediate threat. "I have no quarrel with you," Cora said, her voice gaining strength. "State your business and be on your way. My water is my own." It was the usual reason strangers trespassed on her land. The spring was a siren's call in a thirsty land. The big man did not answer immediately. He looked past her at the sturdy cabin, the neat stacks of firewood, the small, flourishing garden. His gaze seemed to take in every detail of her solitary existence, every piece of evidence of her resilience. Finally, his eyes returned to hers. When he spoke, his voice was a low baritone, the English words carefully formed with only a slight musical accent. "We have not come for water," he said, his voice calm and resonant. "We have not come for war." Cora kept the pistol trained on his chest. "Then what have you come for?" The Apache leader, whose name was Gochimin, let the silence stretch for a moment longer, allowing the weight of his next words to gather. The 6 other warriors remained mounted, as silent and imposing as statues, their eyes watching the exchange with an unnerving intensity. They were a wall of muscle and menace, a silent chorus to their leader's solo. Gochimin took one more slow, deliberate step forward, ignoring the pistol aimed at his heart. He looked directly into Cora's pale blue eyes, and for the first time, she saw something other than stoic resolve in his expression. It was a deep, unwavering seriousness, an ancient gravity that seemed to emanate from him. "My name is Gochimin," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I am the son of a great chief. These are my brothers and my most trusted warriors." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her from the frayed hem of her denim trousers to the wild strands of sun-bleached hair that had escaped her braid. "We have journeyed for 3 days from the Sierra Madre. We have come to ask you to be my wife." The words struck Cora with the force of a physical blow. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the relentless sun, the silent mountains, the 7 giants before her, all blurring into an incomprehensible tableau. Her finger tightened on the trigger, the cold steel of the pistol, the only real thing in a moment of utter surreality. Triarch. It was a word so foreign, so disconnected from her reality, that it might as well have been from another language. For a woman who had spoken to no one for years, the proposal of marriage from a 7-foot Apache warrior she had never seen before was not just unthinkable. It was madness. The silence that followed Gochimin's declaration was heavier and more profound than any Cora had ever known. It was a silence filled with the buzzing of flies, the distant cry of a hawk, and the frantic, disbelieving thump of her own heart. The Colt peacemaker in her hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. She stared at the Apache leader, searching his granite face for any sign of mockery or deceit, but found only an unyielding solemnity. "You're crazy," she finally breathed, the words coming out as a harsh whisper. "Stark raving mad." Gochimin did not react to her insult. His patience seemed as vast and deep as the sky above them. "It is not madness," he stated simply. "It is our purpose." "Your purpose?" Cora's voice rose laced with a mix of fear and incredulous anger. To ride onto a stranger's land, and she couldn't even bring herself to repeat the ridiculous proposal. "Get off my property, all of you. Now." She gestured with the barrel of her pistol toward the ridge from which they had come. The 6 mounted warriors shifted slightly, a subtle ripple of movement that spoke of disciplined readiness. They looked to their leader, awaiting his command. Gochemin, however, remained perfectly still. "We will not leave," he said, his tone not threatening but factual. "Not until you have heard our offer in full." "I've heard enough," she retorted. "I don't know who you are or what kind of game you're playing, but I'm not interested. The answer is no. Now leave or I'll start shooting. I'm a damned good shot." To prove her point, she shifted her aim slightly and fired. The roar of the .45 caliber round shattered the afternoon stillness. The bullet kicked up a puff of dust a foot to the left of Gochemin's moccasins. It was a warning shot, a clear and unambiguous statement. The Apache leader didn't so much as flinch. His dark eyes remained locked on hers, his expression unchanging. His men too remained stone-faced, their composure utterly unnerving. They were warriors, and the bark of a single pistol was no threat to them. It was a child's tantrum. "You are a good shot," Gochemin acknowledged, his voice still maddeningly calm. "But you have only 5 more bullets in that weapon. There are 7 of us. We do not wish you harm, woman of the spring. We wish to honor you." "Honor me," Cora laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "By making me your squaw, I'd sooner die." The term squaw hung in the air, ugly and sharp. A flicker of something, perhaps anger, perhaps disappointment, passed through Gochemin's eyes so quickly she almost missed it. "You misunderstand," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "A wife of a Chiricahua chief is not a slave. She is the heart of the lodge. She is respected. She is protected. You would want for nothing. Food horses, blankets, protection from all enemies. Your life of toil would be over." He gestured around at her small, hard Scrabble homestead. "You are alone. You fight for every scrap. Every day is a battle against the sun, the drought, the predators. With us, you would be part of a people. You would never be alone again." His words struck a raw nerve. He had, with a few simple sentences, perfectly summarized the brutal, exhausting truth of her existence. The loneliness was a constant ache, a phantom limb she had learned to live with. But hearing it spoken aloud by this stranger felt like an indictment, a violation. "I like being alone," she lied, her voice tight. "I choose this life." "No one chooses to be the last one," Gochemin replied, his insight cutting through her defenses. "It is a fate that is given, but it does not have to be the fate you keep." Frustration and a growing sense of helplessness washed over Cora. This was a situation her father had never prepared her for. She knew how to handle rattlesnakes, mountain lions, and desperate prospectors. She had no idea how to handle this. They weren't attacking. They were waiting. Their patience was a weapon far more effective than any rifle. "I have nothing more to say to you," she said, lowering her pistol, though she kept it firmly in her hand. "The answer is no. Today, tomorrow, and forever. Stay or go, it makes no difference to me. But cross that line." She drew an imaginary line in the dirt with the toe of her boot about 10 feet in front of her. "And you'll be digging a bullet out of your gut." Without waiting for a reply, she turned her back on them, a calculated risk, a show of defiance she didn't feel, and walked back to her cabin. The heavy door groaned shut behind her, and she immediately dropped the thick bar into place. Her hands were shaking. She leaned against the door, her eyes closed, listening. She expected to hear the sound of hoofbeats, the sounds of their departure. Instead, there was nothing. just the returning chatter of the birds and the hum of the ever-present wind. Peeking through a small crack in the window shutter, she saw that they had not left. They had dismounted and were in the process of setting up a small, orderly camp near the base of the ridge, well outside the line she had drawn but squarely on her land. They moved with quiet efficiency, tending to their horses, building a small, smokeless fire, and settling in as if they planned to stay for a winter. A cold dread washed over Cora. They weren't leaving. They were laying siege to her solitude. This wasn't a raid or an attack she could fight. It was a test of wills, a silent war of attrition. They had time, they had numbers, and all she had was 100 acres of dirt, a dwindling supply of ammunition, and a loneliness that was suddenly more terrifying than ever before. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, casting long shadows from the 7 silent warriors camped on her land, Cora Abernathy felt a crack appear in the fortress of her isolation, and she feared that what came flooding in might drown her. 3 days passed. The 7 Apache warriors remained. They were a constant, unnerving presence at the edge of Cora's world. They did not approach the cabin again, respecting the boundary she had set. Their discipline was absolute. They hunted in the hills beyond her valley, returning with deer or javelina, the quiet work of skinning and butchering a distant methodical ritual. They spoke little, their voices a low murmur that rarely reached her. They were waiting for what she couldn't be sure. For her to run out of food, to lose her nerve, to simply give in from the sheer psychological weight of their presence. Her supplies were running low, particularly flour and salt. It was a trip she had been putting off, but now it was a necessity. The thought of leaving her homestead unguarded, even for a day, sent a chill of fear down her spine. But staying put was not an option either. She had to go to Redemption Gulch, and perhaps, just perhaps, she could find help. The thought felt foolish, even as it formed. Who in Redemption Gulch would help her against 7 Chiricahua warriors? She rose before dawn on the 4th day, saddling her sturdiest mule Jezebel with practiced hands. She packed 2 empty flour sacks and a small list etched in her memory. As the first pale light of dawn touched the mountain peaks, she unbarred the door and stepped out, a rifle clutched in her hand. The Apache camp was already awake. Gochimin stood by their small fire, a cup of something steaming in his hand. He watched her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He made no move to stop her as she led Jezebel toward the trail that wound out of the valley. As she passed their camp, keeping a wide berth, she could feel the eyes of all 7 men on her. It was like walking through a gauntlet of silent judgment. The ride to Redemption Gulch took half a day. The town was little more than a single dusty street, flanked by a dozen sun-bleached wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, an assayer's office, and a sheriff's office, with a small jail attached. It was a place populated by hard-bitten prospectors, weary ranchers, and women whose eyes held the same resilience Cora saw in her own reflection. She was a known, if not understood, figure here. The Abernathy girl. They called her the Hermit, who lived out by the old Dragoon Pass. She tied Jezebel to the hitching post outside Henderson's Mercantile, the bell above the door announcing her arrival with a cheerful jingle that was jarringly at odds with her mood. The store was cool and dark, smelling of coffee beans, leather, and dried apples. Florence Henderson, a portly woman with a kind face and sharp, curious eyes, looked up from behind the counter. "Cora, child, it's been a while," she said, her voice warm. "You look peaked. Everything all right out your way?" Cora nodded, not trusting her voice. "Just need some flour, salt, coffee, and cartridges. 45.70 for the rifle." As Florence gathered the items, a man who had been lingering by the barrels of pickles and crackers turned toward her. He was Sterling Croft, a man who was quickly buying up land all over the county. He was handsome, in a slick, predatory way, with a neatly trimmed mustache and clothes that were too fine for a dusty town like Redemption Gulch. He owned the large ranch that bordered Cora's property to the north. "Miss Abernathy," Croft said, tipping his hat. His smile didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "A pleasure to see you in town. I trust your spring is still running clear." "It is," Cora said curtly. Croft had made several offers to buy her land offers she had flatly refused. He wanted the water, and he was not used to being told no. "Good, good," he said, stroking his mustache. "A valuable resource like that, a young woman all alone. You must be careful. These are dangerous times. The Apache are restless, I hear." The opening was there. Cora hesitated, torn between her ingrained self-reliance and the desperate need to tell someone. The pressure had been building for days, and it burst out of her in a rush. "I have a problem, Mr. Croft. There are 7 of them. Apache. Camped on my land." Florence Henderson gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Croft's eyes narrowed, a flicker of genuine interest in them now. "On your land, are they threatening you? Raiding?" "No," Cora admitted, feeling the foolishness of her own words. "They're just... there. Their leader. He asked me to marry him." The statement fell into the store's sudden silence like a stone in a well. Florence stared at her as if she'd grown a second head. Croft, after a moment of stunned disbelief, let out a short, sharp laugh. "Marry him," he chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, I'll be. The heat must be getting to them. Or maybe to you, Miss Abernathy." "It's the truth," Cora insisted, her cheeks flushing with anger and embarrassment. "They've been there for 4 days. They won't leave." "Then you need the law," Florence said, her voice a nervous whisper. "Sheriff Kane, he'll run them off." Feeling a new, if fragile sense of purpose, Cora paid for her supplies, loaded them onto Jezebel, and marched across the street to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Bartholomew Kane was a man past his prime, with a drooping mustache and a belly that strained the buttons of his shirt. He was polishing a shotgun, and he looked up with weary disinterest as Cora entered his small, cluttered office. She told her story again, her voice flat and factual, leaving out none of the bizarre details. Kane listened, leaning back in his chair, his expression unchanging. When she was finished, he set the shotgun down and sighed a long, tired sound. "Miss Abernathy," he began, his voice condescendingly patient, "let me get this straight. 7 Chiricahua warriors, who by all accounts should be down in Mexico with Geronimo's band, are camped on your land. They haven't stolen anything. They haven't harmed you. They haven't so much as fired a shot. They're just sitting there, and their chief, who speaks perfect English, has proposed marriage. Is that about the size of it?" "Yes," Cora said through gritted teeth. Kane picked up a piece of paper from his desk and studied it. "Says here, Sterling Croft filed another complaint last week. Said you've been damming up the creek that feeds from your spring, cutting off his water flow." "That's a lie," Cora shot back. "My spring doesn't feed any creek on his property. He just wants my land." "Maybe," Kane said, tossing the paper aside. "But here's my point. I have actual problems. Drunks fighting in the saloon prospectors, claim-jumping each other folks like Croft filing official complaints. What you've got is a story. A fantastical one at that. There's no crime here, Miss Abernathy. There's no law against a man asking a woman to marry him, no matter who he is. And there's sure as hell no law that says I have to ride out into the dragoons and pick a fight with 7 Apache because you don't like them camping. "So you're not going to do anything?" Cora asked, her last sliver of hope crumbling. "There's nothing to be done," the sheriff said, picking up his shotgun again, his tone dismissive. "My advice to you is to either sell your land to Mr. Croft and move somewhere safer, or learn to get along with your new neighbors. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Cora stood frozen for a moment, the injustice of it burning in her chest. She had come to civilization for help, and had found only ridicule and bureaucracy. The law was a shield for men like Croft, not for women like her. Without another word, she turned and strode out of the office, her back ramrod straight. As she mounted Jezebel, she saw Sterling Croft watching her from the porch of the saloon, a smug, satisfied smile on his face. He had been in the sheriff's office before her, she realized. He had poisoned the well, painting her as a liar and a troublemaker. In that moment, Cora understood. She was truly completely alone. The threat was not just the 7 silent warriors on her land, but the smiling, civilized man who wanted what she had, and a system of law that would do nothing to protect her. The ride back to her valley was filled with a cold, hard resolve. If she was going to survive this, she would have to do it herself. The world had drawn its lines, and she was on one side with everyone else, it seemed, on the other. The return to her homestead was somber. The sight of the Apache camp, a thin plume of smoke rising in the late afternoon air, no longer sparked immediate fear, but a weary resignation. They were a part of her landscape now, as fixed and immovable as the mountains behind them. Sheriff Kane's dismissal had extinguished her last hope of outside intervention. This was her battle fought on her terms. The next few days fell into a strange, tense rhythm. Cora went about her chores with a deliberate, almost defiant normalcy. She tended her garden, mended a fence on the far side of the pasture, and spent hours cleaning her rifle, making a quiet show of her preparedness. She was acutely aware of being watched. The Apache warriors were silent observers of her life. They saw the strength in her arms as she hoisted buckets of water from the spring, the skill in her hands as she patched a worn leather strap, the solitude that clung to her like a shroud. She in turn began to watch them, not as a monolithic threat, but as individuals. She saw that one of the younger ones was a gifted archer, practicing for hours with a short, powerful bow. Another was older, with streaks of grey in his hair, and he spent much of his time carving intricate figures into pieces of wood. She saw them laugh quietly amongst themselves, a sound so unexpected it startled her. She saw their reverence for their horses, grooming them with meticulous care. Gochimin seemed to understand that his words had failed, that his proposal was too alien for her to comprehend. So he began to speak in a different language, the language of the land, the one she understood best. One morning she awoke to find a freshly killed rabbit lying on the flat stone that served as her doorstep. It was cleaned and dressed ready for the pan. Her first instinct was suspicion. Was it poisoned a trick? But she examined it carefully. It was a fine, healthy animal. It was a gift, a peace offering. She hesitated, her pride warring with her pragmatism. Wasting good meat was a sin in this land. With a feeling of begrudging concession, she cooked the rabbit for her supper. It was a silent, one-sided communion. A few days later, a storm rolled in from the east, a violent summer squall that unleashed a torrent of rain and wind. A section of fence protecting her small chicken coop was knocked down by a falling branch. Before she could even begin the arduous task of clearing the heavy limb and restringing the wire, 2 of Gochimin's men were there. They didn't speak to her, didn't even look at her directly. They simply worked. With a shared, unspoken understanding, they used their powerful shoulders to heave the branch aside. One of them, the older man with the grey-streaked hair, produced a small coil of sinew from a pouch, and with nimble fingers skillfully repaired the broken wire, making it stronger than it was before. When they were finished, they gave her a slight, respectful nod and walked back to their camp. Cora was left standing in the rain, stunned. It was an act of simple, unasked-for kindness. It was help. Something she hadn't received from another human being in 15 years. The act chipped away another piece of her hardened exterior, revealing a confusing mix of gratitude and suspicion beneath. The most significant moment came a week into their silent vigil. One of her mules, the older one named Bartholomew, had gotten himself tangled in a thicket of mesquite bushes while grazing. He was panicking, pulling against the thorny branches, tearing his own hide and making the tangle worse. Cora's attempts to soothe him were failing. He was too frightened to be led out. Suddenly Gochimin was there, moving with a silent, fluid grace. He didn't approach the panicked animal from the front, but circled around, speaking in a low, crooning voice. The language was not English, but the Apache tongue. It was soft, rhythmic, and strangely calming. Bartholomew's ears, which had been pinned back in fear, began to twitch and then swiveled toward the sound. His frantic struggling lessened. Gochimin continued his low murmur as he approached the terrified mule. He moved without fear, his large hands gentle, as he took hold of the animal's halter. He didn't pull or force. He just stood there, his voice a constant, soothing presence, his hand stroking the mule's sweat-soaked neck. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to untangle the branches, breaking them off one by one, never ceasing his calming monologue. Cora watched, mesmerized. She had always managed her animals through stubbornness and strength. She had never seen this kind of communion, this deep, instinctual understanding between man and beast. After several minutes, the mule was free. Gochimin led him out of the thicket and ran a hand down his flank, checking the scratches. He then looked at Cora, and for the first time, his stoic mask slipped. He offered her a small, almost imperceptible smile. "He has a strong spirit," Gochimin said. "Like you." Cora didn't know how to respond. The defenses she had so carefully constructed were beginning to feel less like a fortress and more like a cage. These men were not the savage monsters of the tales told in Redemption Gulch. They were disciplined. They were respectful. They were providers and protectors. Gochimin hadn't just freed her mule. He had shown her a glimpse of a world she didn't know existed, a world of patience and harmony with the wild things she had spent her whole life fighting against. She looked from her mule, now calmly nuzzling Gochimin's shoulder, to the Apache chief. She saw the quiet strength in his eyes, the deep lines of responsibility etched on his face. He was not a threat. He was a leader. He was offering her not servitude, but partnership. The thought was still terrifying, still alien, but it was no longer mad. That evening, as she treated Bartholomew's cuts with a salve, she found herself humming a tune her mother used to sing a melody she hadn't recalled in years. The silence of her valley was no longer empty. It was filled with a watchful presence, and for the first time in a very long time, it felt less like loneliness and more like anticipation. Nearly 2 weeks had passed since the 7 warriors had arrived. The homestead had found a new, strange equilibrium. Cora no longer brandished her pistol when she stepped outside. The Apache no longer felt like invaders, but like a silent, watchful extension of the landscape. Their gifts of game continued, and she found herself leaving a small portion of her garden's harvest squash and beans on the same stone where they left the meat. It was a silent trade, a fragile truce built on mutual respect. Yet the central question remained unanswered, hanging in the air as thick as the summer heat. Why? Why her? It couldn't be for her beauty. The sun and wind had weathered her face, and her hands were calloused and rough. It couldn't be for her land. They were a people of the mountains, not farmers. The mystery of it gnawed at her. One evening, as the sun set fire to the western sky, Gochemin approached the cabin alone. He stopped at the line she had drawn in the dirt so long ago, a line that now seemed symbolic of a chasm between two worlds. "Cora Abernathy," he called out, his voice respectful. "May I speak with you? The time has come for you to know the reason." Cora, who had been cleaning her rifle on the porch, hesitated. Her fear had been replaced by a deep, consuming curiosity. She nodded, setting the rifle down but keeping it within arm's reach. "Speak." Gochemin did not cross the line. He stood there, a tall, imposing silhouette against the dying light, and began to tell a story. 16 years ago. He began, his voice low and resonant. My father, the great Chief Cochius, led a small war party through these mountains. They were not raiding. They were returning to our stronghold in the Sierra Madre after a council with the Navajo. They were ambushed, not by soldiers but by Mexican bounty hunters, men who hunted our people for gold. Cora listened, captivated, the pieces of a puzzle she never knew existed beginning to stir in her memory. The fight was fierce, Gochemin continued. My father was gravely wounded. A bullet had shattered his leg. He could not ride. He told his warriors to leave him to save themselves. They refused, but the bounty hunters were closing in. My father hid himself in a small cave, preparing to die, fighting so that his men could escape. He was alone, bleeding his life, fading with the sun. Gochemin paused, his dark eyes meeting hers across the twilight. But he was not alone. A white man found him. A man with hair the color of corn silk and eyes like the summer sky. A man who lived in this very valley. Cora's breath caught in her throat. My father, she whispered. Yes, Gochemin affirmed. Oren Abernathy. He was out hunting and heard the sounds of the battle. He found my father near death. He could have left him. He could have killed him himself and claimed the bounty. He did neither. He saw not an Apache but a man in need. He carried my father back to this cabin. He and your mother, they cleaned his wound, set the bone, and hid him from the bounty hunters who searched the area for days. Flickering images, the hazy, half-forgotten memories of a 6-year-old girl surfaced in Cora's mind. A strange, dark-skinned man in her father's bed. Her mother's hushed warnings to be quiet. The smell of strange herbs. The low, guttural sounds of a language she didn't understand. It had all been real. For 2 weeks, your parents nursed my father back to health. Gochemin said, his voice filled with a profound reverence. They shared their meager food. They protected him at great risk to themselves. When he was strong enough to travel, your father gave him a mule and enough food for the journey and showed him a secret pass through the mountains. Before my father left, he made a vow. He swore an oath of blood and honor. Gochemin took a step forward, his feet finally crossing the invisible line. He was not a threat, but an emissary of the past. My father swore that the debt between the house of Cochisa and the house of Abernathy would never be forgotten. He swore that our people would forever see this land, this spring, not as a place to be conquered, but as a sacred place under our protection. And he made one final promise. He saw you a small girl with your mother's blue eyes playing by the door. He told your father, one day, when she is a woman, my son will come. He will come to join our bloodlines. He will unite our families, so that the debt of life you have given me will be repaid for all generations. The daughter of the man who saved my life will be honored as the wife of the man who will lead my people." The pieces clicked into place with a stunning, earth-shattering clarity. This wasn't a whim. This wasn't a conquest. It was a promise. A sacred 16-year-old oath made between a chief and a homesteader. It was a matter of honor, the most powerful currency in the Apache world. "My father died 2 winters ago." Gochimin concluded, his voice soft. "His last words to me were of his debt to your family. He commanded me to fulfill his vow. I have come not to take a bride, Cora Abernathy. I have come to honor my father's word, to offer you the protection of my name, the strength of my people, and to finally repay a debt of blood. By joining us, you seal the bond your father forged. You ensure this land will be protected by the Chiricahua forever. You become one of us." Cora sank down onto the steps of her porch, her legs suddenly weak. Her entire life, her entire understanding of her place in the world had been turned on its head. Her father wasn't just a simple farmer who had died of a fever. He was a man who had, with a single act of compassion, bound his daughter's destiny to that of a great Apache chief. She looked at Gochimin, truly seeing him for the first time. He was not a suitor seeking a wife. He was the son of a king fulfilling a sacred duty, and the hand he was offering was not just a proposal of marriage, but the closing of a circle that had begun long ago with an act of kindness in the wilderness. The choice before her was suddenly infinitely larger than she had ever imagined. It was not about her loneliness or her fear. It was about legacy honor and a debt that could only be paid by the joining of 2 worlds. The revelation left Cora reeling. She spent the next day in a daze, her mind replaying Gochimin's story, seeing her father not as a fading memory, but as a man of quiet, profound courage. The Apache on her land were no longer strangers. They were the embodiment of a promise made to her family. The weight of the decision before her was immense. To accept was to leave behind the only life she had ever known. To refuse was to dishonor the memory of her father and the sacred oath of a chief. Her turmoil, however, was about to be violently interrupted. In redemption, Gulch Sheriff Kane's dismissal and Cora's strange story had been the spark Sterling Croft needed. He saw his chance to seize the Abernathy Spring not through legal means, but through brute force, cloaked in the guise of righteous concern. He spread the story through the saloon, embellishing it with every telling. The 7 Apache weren't peaceful suitors. They were a war party, holding the poor, terrified Abernathy girl hostage. They were a threat to the entire territory. He found fertile ground in the fear and prejudice of the town's rougher elements. With promises of whiskey and pay, he quickly assembled a posse of 12 men, not concerned citizens, but hard cases drifters, and hired guns who were loyal only to Croft's coin. Sheriff Kane, either through cowardice or complicity, chose to look the other way, busying himself with paperwork and declaring it a civil matter outside his jurisdiction. As dusk fell on the 2nd day, after Gochimin's revelation, Croft and his men rode out of Redemption Gulch, their canteens filled with whiskey and their minds set on violence. Their plan was simple: ride in, kill the Apache under the pretext of a rescue, and convince the grateful Cora to sell her land for her own safety. If she proved ungrateful, they would deal with her too. Cora was on her porch, watching the stars begin to appear in the twilight sky when she heard it. Not the silent tread of Apache moccasins, but the heavy, clumsy sound of shod horses, too many of them moving too quickly. She grabbed her rifle, her heart leaping into her throat. From the Apache camp, a sharp, low whistle cut through the air, a signal. Gochimin and his warriors had heard it too. They melted into the rocks, and shadows at the base of the ridge becoming invisible, their rifles ready. Gochimin moved swiftly and silently toward the cabin. "Get inside," he hissed, his voice urgent as he reached the porch. "It is not a patrol. They ride with anger." "Who?" Cora asked, her knuckles white on the stock of her rifle. "The man from the town," Gochimin said. "The one who covets your water. He comes to make war." There was no more time for questions. The posse thundered into the valley, a disorderly mob of men led by Sterling Croft. They were not quiet. They were shouting their voices, slurring with drink. "All right, you savages, party's over," Croft bellowed, pulling his horse to a halt. "Let the woman go and we might let you live." His men fanned out their pistols, and rifles drawn their faces ugly in the fading light. They were a stark contrast to the disciplined Apache, a pack of snarling dogs facing down a silent pride of lions. "This is my land," Cora shouted from the doorway of her cabin, her rifle leveled. "You're the ones trespassing, get out!" Croft laughed. "Playing along with them, are you, little lady? Don't you worry, we'll save you." He raised his pistol. "Last chance. Heathens." The first shot was not fired by the Apache or by Cora. It came from one of Croft's drunkest men, a wild shot that splintered the wood of the cabin doorframe inches from Cora's head. That was the end of the talking. The world exploded in a cacophony of gunfire. From the rocks, the Apache rifles answered with deadly precision. Two of Croft's men were knocked from their saddles before they could even fire a second shot. The warriors fired, moved, and fired again, their positions constantly shifting, making it seem as if they were 3 times their number. They were not fighting a brawl. They were conducting a hunt. Cora, reacting on pure instinct, fired her rifle from the doorway, the heavy 45-70 round, taking another of the hired guns in the chest. She worked the lever action, chambering another round her movements, fluid and sure. She was no longer just defending her home. She was fighting alongside the men who had come to honor her. Gochimin did not take cover. He stood his ground, a fearsome figure, directing his men with hand signals, his own rifle barking death into the disorganized posse. He was protecting her, drawing fire to himself, a chief leading from the front. The firefight was brutal and short. Croft's men were mercenaries, not soldiers, faced with a disciplined, unseen enemy and watching their comrades fall. Their whiskey-fueled courage evaporated. Within minutes, half of them were dead or wounded. The rest broke and fled, galloping madly back toward the perceived safety of town. Sterling Croft found himself alone, his horse shot out from under him. He scrambled behind the animal's body, his fine clothes covered in dust and blood, his face a mask of terror. He fumbled to reload his pistol, his hands shaking. Silence fell as sudden and complete as the eruption of violence had been. The only sounds were the groans of the wounded and the nervous whinnying of a horse. Cora stepped out from her cabin, her rifle still hot. Gochimin and his warriors emerged from the shadows converging on Croft's position. They surrounded him, 7 silent, grim-faced judges. Croft looked up from his pathetic cover, his eyes wide with fear. He saw Cora standing beside Gochimin, rifle in hand. He saw the cold fury in her eyes and the utter contempt in the Apache leader's face. In that moment, he knew he had not just lost a gunfight. He had fundamentally misjudged everything. He had seen a lonely woman and 7 savages. He had failed to see a queen and her royal guard. "This land is protected, Croft," Cora said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. "By me, and by my future husband." The words, spoken in the heat of battle and its aftermath, sealed her choice. She had made her decision not in quiet contemplation, but in a crucible of smoke and gunfire. Gochimin looked at her, and in his dark eyes she saw not just honor and duty, but a fierce, burning pride. The serpent from the gulch had been defeated, and in his place a bond forged in a debt of blood was now sealed in the fire of combat. The aftermath of the battle was stark and silent. The moon rose, casting a ghostly pallor over the valley, illuminating the bodies of the men Sterling Croft had led to their deaths. There was no victory celebration, only the grim business of survival. 2 of Gochimin's warriors had sustained minor wounds, and Cora, without hesitation, brought out the medical supplies her father had kept. She cleaned and bandaged their injuries with a gentle, steady hand, her touch a silent message of alliance. Gochimin dealt with Croft. He did not kill him. Killing him would have been an act of war, inviting retribution from the white world. Instead, he delivered Apache justice. He and his men took Croft's guns and his boots, leaving him with a single canteen of water. "Walk back to your town," Gochimin said, his voice cold as steel. "Tell your sheriff what happened here. Tell him that the Abernathy land is under the protection of the Chiricahua. Anyone who rides against this woman again will be considered an enemy of our people. There will be no warning next time." They watched as Croft, humiliated and terrified, stumbled off into the darkness, a broken man. He was a serpent defanged, his venom spent. By mid-morning the next day, a second more official posse arrived. This one was led by a reluctant Sheriff Kane, who had been shamed into action by the panicked, incoherent tales of the survivors. He rode into the valley, expecting to find a scene of carnage and a captive woman. Instead, he found Cora Abernathy sitting on her porch, calmly sipping coffee with Gochimin standing nearby. The bodies of Croft's men had been gathered respectfully to one side. "Miss Abernathy," Kane began, his voice uncertain. Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly fine, Sheriff," Cora replied, her voice cool and steady, though I can't say the same for Mr. Croft's associates. "They attacked my home. They fired on me. My guests and I simply defended ourselves." She used the word guests deliberately, and its meaning was not lost on Kane. He looked from the calm, confident woman on the porch to the towering, stoic Apache leader beside her. He saw the easy alliance between them, the shared strength. He saw the bodies of the dead, hired guns. He looked at the disciplined warriors who were now cleaning their rifles in the morning sun. The story he had been fed in town crumbled to dust. He had been a fool, and his inaction had led to this. "Croft claimed you were being held hostage," he said, weakly trying to salvage some authority. "Does it look like I'm being held hostage, Sheriff?" Cora asked, raising an eyebrow. She stood up and walked to stand shoulder to shoulder with Gochimin. "Sterling Croft is a liar and a thief who tried to murder me for my land. He's the criminal here. These men," she said, gesturing to the Apache, "saved my life." Sheriff Kane looked at the evidence, at the quiet dignity of the Apache, and at the unyielding strength in Cora's eyes. He knew he was outmaneuvered and outclassed. To challenge the Apache now would be suicide, and to arrest Cora for defending her home would be ludicrous. "I see," he said, finally, his gaze dropping. We'll take care of the bodies, and I'll have a word with Mr. Croft." He knew, as did everyone, that Croft's power in the territory was broken. He had gambled and lost spectacularly. After the sheriff and his men had gone, taking the dead with them, a new kind of quiet settled over the valley. It was not the silence of loneliness, but the silence of peace and understanding. Cora looked at Gochimin, at the man who had come to claim her as part of a debt, who had waited with infinite patience, and who had ultimately fought to protect her. "My father's oath is fulfilled," he said softly. "The debt is paid. You are safe. If you wish us to leave, we will go." He was giving her a final choice, a choice free from obligation or the pressures of battle. Cora looked around at the small cabin, the stubborn garden, the familiar lines of the mountains. It had been her entire world a fortress against her loneliness. But it was also a cage. Gochimin was offering her not just protection, but a life beyond the confines of this valley. A life with a people, a family. A life where she would never be alone again. "You came to ask for my hand in marriage," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You never heard my answer." Gochimin waited, his dark eyes searching hers. A slow smile spread across Cora's face, a genuine, radiant smile that transformed her weathered features into something beautiful. "The answer is yes." It was not the ending anyone could have predicted. Not the townspeople, not Sterling Croft, and certainly not Cora Abernathy herself. Her life would not be one of quiet solitude. It would be a life of movement, of living between two worlds, the world of her father's cabin and the world of the Chiricahua people. It would be challenging and strange, but it would be hers. She would not leave that day or the next. There were preparations to be made. But as she stood on her porch, side by side with the Apache chief who was now her future, she watched the sun rise over the Dragoon Mountains, illuminating a future she had never dared to imagine. The lone woman of the valley was alone no more. She was the heart of a new lodge, the bridge between two legacies, and her story was just beginning. Cora Abernathy's story is a powerful testament to the fact that the deepest solitude can be broken by the most unexpected destiny. It's a tale that reminds us that courage isn't just about survival, but about having the strength to embrace a future you never envisioned. Her journey from an isolated homesteader to the honored wife of an Apache chief is a dramatic clash of cultures, a story of hidden debts, and a powerful example of a woman's unbreakable spirit in the heart of the untamed West. It proves that honor, respect, and love can speak a language that transcends all boundaries. If this slice of frontier drama resonated with you, and if you believe in the power of stories to connect us to our past, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this story with a friend who loves a real-life epic, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales that bring the forgotten corners of history to life. Your support keeps these legends alive. Thank you for listening.